الحضور، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أسعد الله صباحكم جميعا بكل خير. مرحبا بكم في أول أيام فعاليات القمة الحكومية. في الحقيقة هذه القمة اللي تعتبر وبكل فخر هي الحدث الأول على مستوى الوطن العربي، الحدث في الحقيقة الذي يجمع النخبة من رواد التطوير الحكومي ويجمع النخبة من القيادات على مستوى دولة الإمارات ومستوى الوطن العربي تحت منصة واحدة وتحت مظلة للتشاور والتباحث وتبادل الأفكار وتبادل في الحقيقة أفضل الممارسات في مجال تطوير القطاع الحكومي ومجال تطوير الخدمات الحكومية. دولة الإمارات في الحقيقة وبكل فخر عازمة على استمرارية مشوار التميز واستمرارية مشوار العطاء والتركيز على المواطن والمقيم في دولة الإمارات لينعم برفاهية العيش وينعم في الحقيقة برفاهية الخدمات المميزة. سيدي سمو الشيخ محمد بن راشد آل مكتوم نائب رئيس الدولة رئيس مجلس الوزراء دائما يكرر الإنسان قبل المكان، وها نحن اليوم نجتمع تحت هذه المظلة، مظلة القمة الحكومية. هناك أكثر من 2000 مشارك في هذه القمة، هناك أكثر من 50 متحدث بارز في مستوى تطوير القطاع الحكومي والخدمات الحكومية، هناك أكثر من 30 حدث وورشة عمل وجلسة حوارية نناقش إن شاء الله فيها الكثير من القضايا التي تهم دولة الإمارات وتهم بالحقيقة دول الجوار والوطن العربي في مجال تطوير الخدمات الحكومية والنهوض بقطاع تطوير الحكومة في دولة الإمارات. أذكر الحضور في هذه الجلسة في الحقيقة أن اللغة العربية هي اللغة الرسمية المعتمدة لإدارة جلسات كافة الأنشطة والفعاليات في هذه الجلسة، وكما هو الحال إن شاء الله ستكون هذه الجلسة تدار باللغة العربية. أذكر الأخوة الحضور أيضا بإمكانية استخدام الهاشتاج الخاص بالجلسة على وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي من فيسبوك وتويتر وغيرها من الوسائل. نحن اليوم في الحقيقة أيها الأخوة في جلسة مميزة، جلسة في الحقيقة نستشرق بها المستقبل ونرى من خلالها ما هو مستقبل الخدمات الحكومية وما هي السيناريوهات التي يجب أن تضعها الحكومة في الحسبان وفي الاعتبار، ويجب العمل عليها من أجل تطوير هذه الخدمات الحكومية بل واستمرار تميزها على المستوى الذي وصلت إليه من تميز. القيادة دائما تصبو بأن لا نقف عند ما تم إنجازه بل نطمح أن نرى المستقبل ونرى ما هو وضع هذه الخدمات وآلية تميزها في المستقبل. اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أرحب بضيوف هذه الجلسة الحوارية وأشكرهم على تلبية الدعوة مقدما والمشاركة في هذه القمة. معنا هذا الصباح السيد آرون مانيام رئيس مركز تطوير السياسات في جمهورية سنغافورة، والسيد آرون أيضا هو مستشار لمبادرة استشارية وطنية حكومية للشباب تحت عنوان كن أنت التغيير. السيد آرون يشغل منصب أستاذ مساعد في برنامج علماء وباحثي الجامعة الذي أطلقته جامعة سنغافورة الوطنية، حيث يدرس منهاجا بعنوان القيادة في عالم معقد. معنا أيضا من الولايات المتحدة معنا أيضا من بريطانيا الدكتور جيف مولغان، وهو المدير السابق لوحدة الاستراتيجية الحكومية وهو رئيس قسم السياسات في مكتب رئاسة مجلس الوزراء في الحكومة البريطانية. الدكتور مولغان قبل ذلك أسس وأدار المركز الإبداعي، وهو ما يسمى الثينك تانك ديموس، وشغل منصب رئيس مستشاري رئيس الوزراء. الدكتور مولغان أيضا هو أول رئيس تنفيذي لمؤسسة الشباب، وهي مركز رائد للإبداع الاجتماعي والأبحاث المشتركة. معنا أيضا جاري هنا السيد برينتون كافين، وهو كبير المديرين التنفيذيين ومؤسس المركز الأسترالي للابتكار الاجتماعي. السيد برينتون بدأ حياته المهنية في مكتب رئاسة مجلس الوزراء لتقديم الاستشارات إلى الحكومتين الأسترالية والبريطانية حول السياسة الحكومية وتحسين الأداء وإدارة التغيير. يقدم بشكل منتظم عروضاً ومحاضرات للجمهورين المحلي والعالمي حول طيف واسع من المسائل المرتبطة بالابتكار الاجتماعي وإصلاح القطاع الحكومي. ورحب بكم جميعاً في دولة الإمارات وفي هذه القمة الحكومية. حضورنا الكريم، الجلسة ستوزع كالآتي: سنبدأ إن شاء الله بعد قليل باستعراض تجارب المتحدثين الضيوف الكرام لمدة نصف ساعة، 10 دقائق لكل متحدث، ومن ثم سنعرج على فتح باب الحوار والنقاش حول هذه العروض وحول سيناريوهات تقديم الخدمة وآليات تفعيلها في المستقبل. سنبدأ أول هذه العروض مع السيد آرون مانيام، فليتفضل.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to join all of you here today. I'll just wait for my slides to come up, and then we can get going with sharing a little bit about the Singapore government's experience with futures thinking, or what we also call foresight, the thinking about the future in a systematic and intentional way. Yeah. I thought I'd start this presentation by mentioning that the act of governance, how we go about managing public policy, is constantly changing. In Singapore, we began in the mid-1960s with needing to provide security and basic services for our citizenry and our public. These were put to do not just with defense and internal security, but also with things like health, to provide the basic health infrastructure that ensured we had a population that went about its work in the most safe and secure way. Quite rapidly, though, we realized in the middle of the 1960s and the early 1970s that security alone was not enough. We needed to start dealing with the fact that we had to be efficient. In a world where resources are highly scarce, we needed to find ways to have resources apportioned in the most optimal possible way. What we found in the mid-80s, a decade after that, is that we also had to start building institutions in a way that allowed us to deal with the increasing volatility of the international environment. You'll find that so far, these functions of government have been growing. They don't replace each other. Security and scarcity continue to be important, but volatility is there as an additional constraint and additional priority for the government to actually deliver on. Towards the middle of the 1990s, we found that we had new aims to achieve. We had to start dealing with an increasingly complex environment, and had to, in order to do this, to be adaptive and innovative as much as we could be. And at the moment, after the new millennium came along, we're finding that we need to deal with growing diversity. The fact that our citizenry is more empowered, more educated, and therefore seeking to be engaged in a much more systematic way than they were before. As these challenges and demands on governance have grown, what we found is that foresight and thinking about the future in a systematic way is actually very, very important. We started doing this in the mid-1980s, in the period of dealing with increasing volatility that I talked about earlier. And this began as an experiment in our military. Many things begin in the military, I think, because it's large enough to be a good ecosystem for experimentation. After about 10 years, we found that it was important to start centralizing this function and making sure that all of government could deal with the importance of planning for the future. And out of the military, we moved it into the Prime Minister's office so that it could be done at the center of government and in a way that allowed it to cascade into the broader government infrastructure. Towards the early 2000s, we renamed the office from scenario planning, which was just one tool that we used, to a broader name, something that we now call strategic policy, because we realized that the scenarios themselves were just tools. They were a basic way of thinking about the future, but the ultimate aim was not to produce scenarios. It was really to think about how we do governance and policy making in a much better and hopefully more sophisticated way. Today, we find that we've got new ways to complement scenarios. We think a lot about an act that we call risk assessment and horizon scanning, which is something that takes place in another twin part of the Prime Minister's office. This allows us to analyze the future and to look at small trends that are not very major today, but in the future could become very, very important for Singapore. We also set up something that we now call the Center for Strategic Futures, which is part of the Strategic Policy Office. It allows us to think in new ways about the kinds of new issues that might actually end up impacting Singapore, but that scenario planning alone, the methodology that was pioneered by Shell and the Global Business Network, actually don't highlight in a significant enough way. What we're also finding is now foresight units are being established all over government, not just within the Prime Minister's office, so that in addition to the centralized function that we now have, we're also having people in the Trade Ministry, in the Manpower Ministry, and in all parts of government thinking about the future using a range of methodologies. In all of the work that we do, the basic aim is to ensure that Singapore is anticipatory, that it is able to adapt to a constantly changing and turbulent environment. And we try to do this in three main ways. First of all, the green part of this slide talks about experimentation and discovery, the fact that we're always engaged in a journey of learning. We find that we also need to forge networks. That's the green part of this slide, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a while. And finally, the blue bit about building resilience through risk governance is how all the different pieces in analyzing the future come together. So let me say a bit more about each of these things, just to give you a flavor of how we go about doing this. First of all, experimentation and discovery. And one thing that's important we found is that analyzing the future has to be a constant process of creation. It's not something that government agencies can do simply because they want to be efficient, and it's not something that they can plan in a very structured or blueprinted way. They need, therefore, to be constantly experimental. And one of the ways we find it's useful to do this is through a process we call the national scenarios, thinking through what big picture futures exist for Singapore and how those things might impact us in the longer term. The latest exercise of the national scenarios has seen us look at both the external environment, the shifting international dynamics with the rise of China, the emergence of India, and a much more multipolar world, as well as internal environments that are changing. The fact that our citizenry is now more educated, the fact that they are demanding more and more to be involved in the act of governance and not just have it given to them in a directive way by a government that assumes to know better than they do. We also try to complement the national big picture scenarios with much more focused scenarios, looking at issues like the public service specifically, or looking at issues like the future of work, which are not as macro as the national scenarios, but nonetheless allow us to analyze the future on more specific issues that could actually be very relevant for Singapore. We also try and produce think pieces on major trends that might affect us. One of the most major ones is the idea of humanity 2.0, how emerging science and technology, whether through drugs or human augmentation, might result in new types of human beings in the future. And we see examples of this already. Many of us have knee implants, or we take drugs to enhance our eyesight. If we put all that together, that could actually end up impacting quite significantly on the kind of future that we see and the kind of workforce that we aim to create in Singapore. Another big issue that we've been looking at is the issue of energy abundance through the emergence of shale gas and what that might mean for North American energy abundance, and the fact that its kind of resource security from there could actually change the whole nature of international trading patterns and international economic exchange. In analyzing all of these, we cannot do this alone. And we need to therefore build significant sets of networks that we can tap so that we learn from others and not just get caught in the internal thinking and assumptions that the government might have. We try to do this in a range of ways, both within government, where different agencies exchange perspectives, so that no single perspective is one that dominates. We find that that's very important in order for the different parts of government to exchange ideas with one another and actually find that they learn from each other in that process. We also find that an important way of facilitating this internal government network is through internal training. And here we have a suite of tools that we call Future Craft, building the craft of the futurist, that allow us to exchange ideas and be able to have a common set of methodologies that we use in order to analyze the future in a systematic way. We also try to reach out beyond government in Singapore to other parts of our local environment, whether it's universities or businesses, so that we learn not just from the government's assumptions, but the kind of assumptions that other parts and other sectors start to make. We find this multi-sectoral nature of futures is very important because it allows us to tap into the very different worldviews and mental models that exist outside the public sector. Of course, for a small country like Singapore, we also need to reach out internationally, and attending events like this governance summit is one major way in which we learn from the experience of others, learning from a global network that includes all the different entities that you see on this slide, both government entities, corporate entities, as well as international civil society, which help us to learn from the different sets of worldviews that all of these organizations actually undertake. All of this, when put together, allows us to build what we like to call a resilient risk governance structure. And what we mean by that is it allows us to have a framework within which we identify issues that might be important for Singapore, but not just identify them, we also try and do something about them. So after identification and assessment and appraisal, we find that the bottom part of this slide, which deals with mobilization and behavioral change, is actually the most critical. Once we've analyzed the future, we need to then tap on the citizenry and have them find ways to actually take action on the different parts of that future. So if we go back to the fact that we started off with the earlier idea of diversity and engagement, we're currently involved in an experiment that we call the Singapore Conversation, which allows us to tap into the broader citizenry's perspective and not just the views of individual experts within government. And I'd be happy to say more about this during the question and answer session later. If I can bring you back to the idea, and I'll end off with this slide. We started with looking at the issues of basic security, scarcity, and volatility. Futures now allows us to analyze that kind of volatility in a much more systematic way. Complexity is something that the Center for Strategic Futures and the risk assessment system allow us to look at much more structuredly. And in the process, we've also found that we can engage diversity in a much more systematic way through the crowdsourced futures like the national conversation that I mentioned. So I'm looking forward to your questions in a while. Thank you.
نشكر السيد آرون مانيام على عرضه الطيب، وندعو الدكتور جيف مولغان لأيضا التعليق على ما لديه هذا اليوم.
Assalamu alaikum. It is an honor to be with you today. My job is Chief Executive of the UK's National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. We are sometimes an investor, sometimes a researcher, but also run practical programs, often in partnership with government, on healthcare and education and public services. And what I would like to do, if my slides appear, is to share some thoughts about where public services may be heading in the next 10 or 20 years. Is this working? Here we go. And in some ways, my message is very simple. I think many of you will have experience of the implementation of business concepts into public services. So the use of targets, performance management, contracting out, trying to use the processes which work well in Toyota or Walmart and applying them to public services. I think we will still see more of this in the next 10 or 20 years. But what I want to emphasize is a slightly different story from government delivering services to people in the way we might deliver a letter, a postcard, which I think has been the dominant framework for the last 10 or 20 years. And instead, we are seeing a different pattern where for some services, government does things to people, provides information, infrastructure, policing. Sometimes government provides things for people, economic policy, defense, and regulation. But increasingly, we need to learn also how to provide services with people where they have to work to provide the outcome. And in health or education or the environment, this is where services are going, and this requires different methods from those from Toyota, Walmart, and so on. And the implication is what I would call the birth of a relational state, relational models of public service, which will I think, affect every aspect of KPIs, policy, contracting, and so on. Here we see a simple diagram for understanding different kinds of service. On the left axis, how much engagement do you want from the citizen? For some at the bottom, we want services to be as simple as possible, as easy, as little friction. But at the top, when it comes to healthcare or education, we do need the public to work in the provision of the service. And on the bottom axis, we describe how much choice, freedom, and coercion is there. So for some issues such as policing, payment of fines, prisoners, there is a fair amount of coercion. So the top left-hand corner I would see as the field of social innovation, which Brenton will be talking about later, often involving civil society in generating new models of engagement of the public. And at the bottom, we have automation. This is the space where there is much more scope for using technology to simplify, speed up services, and where there's still a lot to adapt from business. A couple of examples of this in relation to aging, which is the most important pressure on public services in many parts of the world. Experiments are underway with things like personal budgets, giving older people control over money so they can purchase services either from business, but also sometimes from friends and family. We are introducing into the UK a model called Ties, which uses social media to construct a network around a vulnerable older person, linking the doctor, the social worker, but also the rest of the family, the neighbours, to help keep that person well. Governing with also means involving the public in ideas. This is the US's crowdsourcing platform, challenge.gov. And this is a very different model called Fix My Street, which allows the public to share in communicating where street lights or physical infrastructure is broken, and again, working with the state to put things right. And this has now spread to many countries around the world. I want to mention one other example. This will work. Am I stuck? Which is a new model of school. And this is the Studio School, which is in part about opening public services to new entrants, new ideas, not just the existing incumbents. But studio schools are relevant because they involve business and the public in running the school. Most of the curriculum is done through real-life practical projects rather than through just sitting in classrooms. And usually they are projects working in small businesses, getting experience of the workplace. The British government is spreading these fast because they have doubled exam results everywhere they have been tried, but they are also about ensuring 18-year-olds understand the world of work they will be moving into. The two other things I wanted to mention are, first of all, about evidence. In 2 weeks' time, the British Prime Minister will announce a number of new evidence centres for each field of public service, which will act as centres of knowledge about what works and what doesn't. We have a model in healthcare, a body called NICE, which publishes the cost per result of every health intervention, from new drugs to new services. And we want every policymaker, every deliverer of public services to be aware of the evidence globally of their field. This is an example from the US. Sorry, I can get this to work. of the sort of chart mapping evidence in criminal justice, showing a range of different interventions, their effectiveness, their cost, and the variability in that evidence. And we want this to be part of the daily life of every head teacher in schools, hospital manager, police leader. And I hope we may work with some of you on building up sophisticated evidence about what works. One of the things, though, this evidence points us towards is the need to think more systemically about public services. And again, this is where the business models often reach their limits. You take a topic like obesity. Oh, I'll jump over these. Childhood obesity, which is spreading all over the world. This is caused by many factors, from regulation to transport policy to advertising by business. We need much more systemic answers to that. Another example would be diabetes. If you want to reduce the incidence of diabetes in a population, you have to intervene in many parts of the system, not just through providing insulin or hospital services to your public. And in all of these cases, we are looking at much more systemic ways of organizing public services. A key part of this is becoming more sophisticated about prevention. Where can an investment now deliver returns over the long run? This slide shows just one example, functional family therapy, but I show it really to demonstrate the kind of analysis we are looking for in public services now, where we show in the red bar on the right-hand chart the cost in year one of the intervention, and then show the benefits which accrue to government over many years, some accruing to the state, some to citizens, and some to business. And this sort of detailed analysis of investment in public services, we think will become increasingly important and will bring for it new funding tools, where government pays not for activities or outputs, but for outcomes, only rewarding contractors if they can demonstrate better employment, better education, better health outcomes. Gordon Brown this morning mentioned social impact bonds. This is a model of investment designed exactly for this kind of preventive investment, where we create a new capital, an asset class, to reward models of public service which will save money in 5, 10, or 15 years' time by reducing crime, reducing hospital admissions, reducing unnecessary failure in schools. So this is really all I wanted to say. I think if we look 10 or 20 years ahead, we will see a continuation of the wave of transformation of public services, applying business models, targets, specification, performance management, the sort of thing recommended by consultancies around the world. But I think you need to go further than that, and you can leapfrog some of the systems of public services in the West by being quicker to become more relational, seeing where public services need to embed a relationship between the citizen and the provider, more evidence-based. Most of our services are not based on good evidence, and many of them don't work very well. You don't need to repeat that mistake. And above all, more systemic, looking at where actions now can reduce costs and problems in the future. And I envy you the potential to jump ahead of the often rather stagnant and stuck systems we see in much of North America and Europe. That is your opportunity. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور جيف مولغان. والآن ندعو السيد برينتون كافين أيضا لتقديم آخر عرض في الجزء الأول من هذه الجلسة.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much to the organisers for having me here to speak to you today. I want to pick up on one aspect that Jeff talked about, which is around the need to create a more relational state, a state that has a different kind of relationship with its citizens, and take that a little bit deeper into some techniques for how you actually go about designing services that do exactly that. And I'm going to do that based on some work that we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years in Australia. The Australian Centre for Social Innovation was set up just under 4 years ago, following a recommendation from Jeff to the South Australian government that a new body was required to think differently about creating new services and solutions and relating to citizens in a different way. We were set up with seed funding by the state government, but we were set up as an independent, not-for-profit organisation, which gave us a much, if you like, a greater freedom to experiment and to try and come up with radical solutions. And I'm going to talk about one of those today. But I guess one thing that I wanted to highlight, and it probably comes from the experience of the last few years, but beyond that, from my 15 years or so inside and outside of government, which is the big question, what makes good policy, and how do we translate that into good public services? And for me, and Jeff talked about the background of new public management and adopting business techniques into the public service. We've tried to make services more efficient. We've tried to make them more effective. Jeff and other colleagues in the UK have talked about now making them more relational. And I've got a slightly different terminology for it, but it's the same idea, which is we ought to be making our state more empathic. And what do I mean by empathic? Well, there are two elements to empathy. The first element of empathy is cognitive empathy. That is your ability to understand what somebody is presenting to you. If somebody comes to you with a story, with their situation, you understand who they are and where they're coming from. And the second element is the effective element of empathy. That is, you respond appropriately to that situation. I think there is a paradox that lies at the heart of many public services, that we have teachers and doctors and social workers who individually demonstrate high degrees of empathy, and yet they are often in systems that do not allow that empathy to take full flight. They're often trapped in systems where compliance is the norm rather than flexibility and innovation, and where the emotional intelligence of both the people working in those services and the citizens they're interacting with aren't utilised to their full extent. So 4 years ago, we were given the task of how would you do this differently? So what we did was we assembled a multidisciplinary team, designers, social workers, social scientists, a recovering economist in my case, and we looked at those parts of the system that were most in crisis. And the one part of the system in Australia that jumped out at us was the child protection system. This is the agencies, the authorities that make an assessment whether a child is safe in a family, and if they don't believe that they are safe, they take them out of that family and place them in alternative care. The number of children being removed from Australian homes has gone up 50% in the last decade, 50. So this is clearly an area of policy and an area of public service that is not getting the right outcomes. And so we embarked on a process of co-design to work with families to try and create a new solution. And the solution we came up with doesn't look like your average public service response. It's called Family by Family, and I'd encourage you to Google it, and there are plenty of videos that describe what it does in more detail, but time constraints, I'll just have to quickly describe it. But Family by Family is a network of families helping other families. We find and recruit families who've been through tough times and have come out the other side. These positive deviants have actually succeeded despite the odds. And we connect them up with families who want things to change. And they link up over a period of time and work on specific developmental goals that might be with respect to their children's behaviour, or it might be about setting good examples in the home, it might be about discipline, it might be about hygiene. The families themselves choose the goals that they want to work on, and together they work on that. The role of the professional is to sit behind the scene, to bring these two families together, to make sure it's going on the right track, but otherwise to get out of the way. This is, as Jeff pointed out on his slide, an area where civil society, families themselves, actually are producing the policy outcome. It's not the role of the professional to directly intervene in these families to get the outcome. And so I want to break down this into two elements. The first is the element of co-design, because I think this is a very important way of getting at the issue of policy design from a very different perspective. And this is rather than policy being something that's top-down and come up with high-level principles and someone turns that into operational instructions that goes out to the field workers and hopefully they implement that with some degree of integrity and fidelity to the intent of the policy, this actually starts by going out into the field and working with users, in this case families, to understand what their reality is, what their context is, what they need. And then from that understanding, and we spent 3 months doing ethnographic work with families, spending time in their houses, going shopping with them, walking the kids, exercising, watching TV on the bed, to really understand what life was truly like for them and the sorts of things that they felt they needed to improve. We then took all of that rich information and then started to come up with ideas about how we thought we might be able to make a better outcome for them. And then we took that back out to the families and they helped us test these ideas. They told us what worked, what didn't, and we could iterate many, many times. So by the time we got to the end of this 12-month process, some elements of this program we'd changed 10 or 15 times. And we'd been able to do it very cheaply, very quickly, and to come up with something that works, that resonates for families, that is spoken of in a language that they can understand. It doesn't sound like a government service. It sounds like something that they just feel naturally attuned to. And then the final element is to actually prototype this and to run it as a live experience, to actually test this, what it would happen in real life, again, for a very short period of time, 3 months. And from that, throw stuff out, ideas out when they don't work and adopt things when they do. And we found that after 12 months, we came up with something that was very, very effective for these families. We then have been rolling this out for the last 18 months, and the evaluations have proven remarkable. 90% of the families that engage in this program achieve the goals that they wanted. We've also had examples where families who are at risk of losing their children, 3 children in one particular family, because of their involvement in this program, are now able to look forward to a life with an intact family. The second element I wanted to quickly touch on is this notion of co-production. The families are the resource. This is one of our families helping to recruit other families. And I think particularly in an environment where we're trying to both do more with less, but also where we're trying to make services feel like that people want to engage with them. Engaging citizens in the process of delivering those services is a great way for them to be more empathic. Families can strike up more effective and authentic conversations than any professional can with these families. And so I encourage you to think about these ideas both of designing with users, but also to think about ways that you can engage your users and your citizens in the delivery of these services. And there are some great techniques for co-design that are springing up around the world, in Denmark, in the UK, in Australia, and in Finland. And I'd encourage you to have a look at this area of co-design, because I think it is not going to replace the top-down, high-level strategic policy making, but it will be a very effective supplement to that, to actually really get down to the very nitty-gritty of making interactions work for people. Thank you.
شكرا للسيد برينتون على هذا العرض. إذن أيها الحضور الكريم، نحن نتحدث عن جملة من القوى التي تؤثر على مستقبل الخدمات الحكومية. نتحدث عن أمور تتعلق بربط المجتمع بتطورات الخدمة والوقوف على آرائهم. نتحدث عن مراكز تدعم القرار وتدعم التخطيط لهذه الخدمات، مراكز للأدلة ومراكز لتخطيط سيناريوهات المستقبل. نتحدث عن مدارس نوعية تنشر ثقافة معينة تؤثر في المستقبل على نوعية الخدمات المطلوبة. نتحدث عن تغيرات اجتماعية وتغيرات اقتصادية، ونتحدث عن ثورة في الاتصالات. كل هذه القوى تشكل مستقبل الخدمات وتشكل سيناريوهات مستقبلية لنوعية الخدمة ونوعية التخطيط المستقبلي لهذه الخدمات. تحدث مستر آرون مانيام عن هذه القوى التي تؤثر على تقديم الخدمات المستقبلية في جمهورية سنغافورة. سؤالي إلى السيد